Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for the webinar to populate and then we will get started. Welcome. Just give it a few more seconds as people filter in and then we will dive right in. Yes, if people want to introduce yourselves in the chat, I always love to know where people are joining us from. So please feel free. Thank you, Christy, for getting the ball rolling there. All right, we will get started and anyone who joins us will be able to sort of pop in as they arrive. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much. I am very excited to be joined today by three Jewish leaders from interfaith families for a conversation about how growing up in an interfaith family has influenced their career paths. I'm joined today by, I realize panelists, I'm just mentioning who you are. This is not the part where you all pop on camera. Sorry, this is the first time I'm hosting a webinar. I'm usually a panelist on a webinar, and so some of my instructions to my co-panelists were not so clear. So with that being said, so Rabbi Emily Cohen, Rabbi Eric Woodward, and rabbinical student Becky Jay will share their insights grounded in their personal experience and expertise on how best to engage interfaith families in Jewish life. I was so thrilled when all three of the people I most wanted to be on this panel accepted my invitation. Many of you may have joined us for a learning opportunity before, but for those of you who are new to 18 Doors, welcome. 18 Doors is a Jewish organization working across North America to empower people in interfaith relationships, individuals, couples, families, and their children to engage in Jewish life and make Jewish choices, and encourage Jewish communities to welcome them. Our vision is that people in interfaith relationships are welcomed and embraced by Jewish communities and are able to contribute to Judaism's enduring strength and continuity. We are so glad to have you here with us today in service of this goal. Before we get started, a few housekeeping details. If you require any technical support during the panel, please message Lexi, our administrative program manager. You can find her as Lexi18Doors. We will be taking questions in the last 15 minutes of the panel. Please make sure to submit them to the Q&A box, and I will try and get to as many of them as possible. If you require closed captioning, you can access it by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. Sorry, live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. And finally, we are recording today's session to share with people who are unable to be here with us live. I'm Tema Smith. I'm the Director of Professional Development at 18 Doors. The work of supporting Jewish organizations and the people who lead them in up-leveling their work with interfaith families is close to my heart. I grew up in Toronto, where I am sitting now, in an interfaith, interracial household. And it was only as an adult that I was able to find Jewish spaces that were welcoming of me in the fullness of my identity. My passion as a Jewish professional, first working in Holocaust education, and then spending almost 8 years as a synagogue membership director, has been working to ensure that people like me are able to find places for themselves in our Jewish community and participate fully in the richness of our Jewish traditions. I'm grateful to each and every one of you who works in your communities to support people like me. Now I would like to introduce you to our panelists and kick off our conversation. I will be inviting the panelists to join me in conversation for about 45 minutes, and we'll leave the last 15 minutes for questions from you. And panelists, feel free to join me on screen now. So we have with us today Rabbi Emily Cohen. Rabbi Cohen is a member of the second cohort of 18 Doors Rukhin Rabbinic Fellowship and is the spiritual leader of the West End Synagogue in New York City. She graduated in 2018 from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Prior to joining West End last summer, Rabbi Emily served for 2 years as Lab Shul's Jewish Emergent Network rabbinic resident. Off the pulpit, Emily produces and hosts the podcast Jew 2, Tales of the Mixed Multitude, and enjoys writing for Jewish publications such as Alma and composing Jewish music. She lives in Brooklyn, but tweets wherever you are at that Rabbi Cohen. Becky J is a rising fifth-year rabbinical student at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, also known as HUC, in New York. Becky is proudly from Brooklyn, where she was raised in an interfaith home. She completed her undergraduate degree in American Studies at Yale. Thereafter, completed a 2-year fellowship in Zhuhai, China for the Yale-China Association. Upon returning to the US, she attended Yale Divinity School to pursue religious studies, earning an MA in religion. As a student at HUC, she enjoys studying halachic codes, as well as contemporary dilemmas surrounding diversity, race, and Jewish spaces. She is currently living in Valladolid, Spain, with her partner and 2 dogs, Mao and Thor. Rabbi Eric Woodward has served as a senior rabbi of Tiferet Bet Israel in Bluebell, Pennsylvania, and as assistant rabbi at Congregation Tiferet Israel in Columbus, Ohio. In 2015, he was named by the Forward as one of America's most inspiring rabbis. Born and raised in an interfaith mixed-race Mexican and Ashkenazi Jewish household in LA, Eric moved east to attend Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts, from which he graduated cum laude. Eric was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary and also studied at Yeshivat Hadar in New York. While at JTS, he was a Schusterman Rabbinical Fellow and a Legacy Heritage Rabbinic Fellow, serving as rabbi of Shaarei Torah Synagogue in Canton, Ohio. During his time at JTS, he received multiple awards for homiletics, theology, Talmud, and pastoral care, and completed an intensive unit of chaplaincy at Bellevue Hospital. I love watching panelists' face when I introduce them because you all have the same reaction I always do when people introduce me, and it makes me feel so much better. So thank you all for being here. So just to get us started, I would love it if each of you would take a few minutes to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your path to leadership and what it means to you personally to lead Jewish community in the fullness of your identity. So let's start with Emily.
Okay, thank you so much, Tema, for inviting us, and for putting together this panel. I'm really grateful to be here. So I was born a few years after the Reform movement first opened itself up to patrilineal descent as a valid form of Jewish identity and status. So I have a Jewish father who was raised Reform in San Francisco and a mother who was raised Catholic, figured out pretty early on that it wasn't for her, and was a spiritual seeker who found Quakerism when I was a baby. And when I was born, they hadn't decided for sure what faith to raise me in. They had a Jewish wedding where my father's rabbi from childhood had agreed to do the wedding. And I'm fairly confident that if that hadn't happened, I might not have been raised Jewish. Because that was a moment that so many couples face where they have an interest in a Jewish ceremony, they're told no, and instead of trying to pursue anyway, they feel reasonably hurt and they step back. So I'm incredibly grateful that my parents were able to have their Jewish wedding, and that when they sent me the JCC when I was 2.5 and I came home obsessed with Judaism, they decided, yes, this is definitely the faith in which to raise our children. So I grew up mostly in Richmond, Virginia, where there was not a giant Jewish population. And as such, I had no idea that I was unusual. The vast majority of my friends were people who had one Jewish parent and one parent who was of a different faith. Some had Jewish moms, some had Jewish dads, but it was very normal to have friends in my area, in my synagogue, who came from interfaith families. And so it wasn't until we moved to New Jersey when I was in high school that I can tell you the exact moment. I was sitting on the bus, 10th grade, having a conversation with somebody who was becoming a friend. And she said to me, "Oh, your mom's not Jewish? Oh, so you're not Jewish either." And I was floored. And so from the age of, I would say, 15 until through rabbinical school, I really found myself battling with folks who were saying that I didn't count. It's especially complicated, to talk about the racial dynamics because my name's Emily Cohen. I look like the way that I look, and my mom's name is Judy Cohen, and she teaches at a Jewish day school. And so people made all sorts of assumptions about me, about what my values were, about what my family background was, and it's been painful. But at the same time, I feel immensely grateful for the spaces that were open to me. And so I'll just say quickly about my podcast that I started it a couple of years ago because I realized that even though we had statistics, like data from places like the Pew Foundation, those didn't necessarily reflect the experiences that I was familiar with from Jews on the ground. So a lot of the data that we get states that Jews who are interfaith or are from interfaith families are less likely to be engaged, which doesn't reflect my anecdotal experience. So I decided to start this podcast to tell the stories or to make space for Jews to tell their stories of their families. And it's been really powerful. It's on hiatus right now, but for me, a lot of my work has been about just making space for what I see as the Jewish present, not the Jewish future necessarily, but the Jewish present, to be forward about who we are and what makes us who we are. So yeah, grew up Reform, ended up at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and I don't feel like movements are the be all and end all of Jewish identity. With that said, I think that so long as we have major divisions on Jewish status and what constitutes a Jewish family, the movements are pretty essential because as a rabbi, I want to be able to walk into a space and know whether or not I count as a Jew. And that's a complicated piece of my story. So yeah, I guess I know we're going to get into some questions and I'm eager to share more about that. But for now, I'll just say that I'm really glad to be here, and I am seeking to build a world both at West End, where I'm honored to be the rabbi, and in the rest of my rabbinic life, where Jews like me and like the other folks on this panel are truly seen not as an exception or as a problem, but just as an integral part of the fabric of our people.
Thank you so much, Emily. We are definitely going to get to some of those nuances around who counts and who doesn't, and policy and all of those things. And I'm really excited to dive into it. One thing that many of you may have noticed from the introductions is that we actually have a Reconstructionist rabbi, somebody training to be a Reform rabbi, and somebody who's trained to be a conservative rabbi on this panel, which actually was by accident, but a happy accident. It is perfection, actually. So I am so glad to have sort of that full spectrum of sort of the more liberal ends of the Jewish community represented here. So Becky, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I feel so humbled to be here, especially with two rabbis who in the field who I actually do look up to. So this is kind of a big moment for me. And Tema, of course, and 18 Doors, thank you so much for hosting this panel, which I think is just incredibly important. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and my family is an interracial and interethnic family. My mother is from South Korea and left South Korea as a political refugee, actually, from the Park administration when he was in power after the Korean War. And she was raised Catholic, and our family belongs to a Methodist church still in Brooklyn, in Bay Ridge. And my dad grew up in the Lower East Side, third generation Russian, Polish Jewish immigrants, and grew up at East End Temple in New York. And it's interesting. We actually celebrated everything in our home. So the menorah was just as, prominent in the window as the Christmas tree. And for a long time, I actually didn't really understand why the boundaries, and still to a certain extent, why the boundaries mattered so much to so many people, because I said, like listen, if you just respect everyone's choice, I don't, like, yeah, I have a full weekend. We were dragged to church and synagogue Saturday, Sunday, various religious schools. So that really consumed a large part of our childhood, my sister and my childhood growing up. But still, I think that part of what has led me to kind of commence and continue on this journey is figuring out how we can place love first, and really like the human before us first, instead of looking at labels, which for various racial and ethnic reasons, when I still walk into certain synagogues, I am typecast as definitely not Jewish. And so for me, coming from an interfaith family was especially hard within Jewish spaces because I found my Christian community, which my mother was a leader in, to be so accepting of my layered identity, and my Jewish community not accepting at all, or Jewish communities in general to be quite rigid when it came to determining if I counted for them. And I did have an incredible experience when I did come into adulthood with communities that did accept me in the identities that I hold. And I just wanted to give that to everybody. And so that is what inspired me to attend rabbinical school, especially with my love for Judaism. And I think that for now, that's pretty much my introduction. And as you could see, I'm still fangirling a little over being in the presence of such incredible leaders. But yeah, I think that within the reform movement, I will just say that I think that we have a lot of work to do, and a lot of part of why I wanted to pursue this journey was because for me, what Judaism gave me in adulthood and the community that afforded me the flexibility and the freedom to be who I was, that feeling, that sensation was priceless. And so that's what drives my work when we do all of the work that we do, or at least that I learn about doing in rabbinical school.
Thank you so much, Becky. And Becky, don't underestimate your growing leadership. What I will say, I met Becky, I think you were just finishing your first year of rabbinical school, as a rising Jewish leader of color who had just brilliant insight about her experience showing up in Jewish space as somebody who was sort of racially othered in Jewish communal spaces, and have learned so much from Becky, and I'm excited to continue to learn from Becky. Eric.
So it's so nice to be here, and Becky and Emily and Tema. It's just really wonderful to hear you, and I sort of read things that you guys have written, and it's just lovely to be here. So just like Becky said, I'm really honored to be here. My story is similar and different in kind of the same ways. I grew up in Los Angeles to two parents who were both raised in Los Angeles, but my mother is an Ashkenazic Jew, and her family are Ashkenazic Jews. Her grandparents and great grandparents, so they're sort of descendants of people who came over from Russia in the early 1900s. My father has a very different story. He was born in Los Angeles to two parents. His mother was a woman who came to America from Mexico, from Oaxaca, in 1926, and she came over from Salina Cruz with her mother. And Salina Cruz is like a port city in Oaxaca. And I don't know a lot about her life in Mexico. I know she came with her mother and her baby brother at the time to Los Angeles. And she kind of lived in that kind of mestizo world of Mexico, with some indigenous background. I think her mother spoke some Zapotec, which was sort of one of the sort of groups there, in Spanish, of course, and that was very powerfully her culture. She met my father's father, my grandfather, in America, and he was a he was a white man who had run away from home in Oklahoma. His family were kind of um, gunfighter, like not like what he was like getting to be kind of a hillbilly. And he was not the easiest father or husband. And I know that he used to hit her if she spoke Spanish in the house. And he drank a lot and was physically violent. And my dad doesn't talk about it, but you sort of hear things over time, and I would hear things and other things. And he died before I was born. And my dad's mother was really sort of the main cultural force. And there are actually a lot of people in Los Angeles who are raised in families like this, where one parent is, especially in this time of, in the 20th century, a Mexican immigrant. Today, immigrants from many other places in Central America. But one parent is a Mexican immigrant and one parent is a white American. And he grew up sort of nominally Catholic and didn't connect that much because so much of it was a product of him seeing that as his mother's religion and superstition, whatever it was, he wasn't there. I grew up with a consciousness that I was Jewish, but I also felt like I lived in sort of very culturally mixed world. I had this sort of influence of my father's sort of Mexican-American family. I had my mother's very Ashkenazic family. And I went to a Reform Hebrew school and I became a bar mitzvah there. And I didn't connect all that much just to Hebrew school, like a lot of people don't. And over my yeah, Becky's laughing, right? It's like, it was Hebrew school, it's fine. Over my teens, I just started to get more interested in asking like big questions about the world. And when I went to college, I went to Williams College, which is about as far physically as you can get from Los Angeles in America, and really far temporally or psychologically from Los Angeles. And I realized that I had to try a little more to be Jewish there. And I found my way into the Hillel, to the Jewish Center there. And it was exciting to realize that I could identify as Jewish. And I actually remember, how I could connect to this. And Becky told a story, or Emily, I actually don't remember which one of you told this story, but I think Emily, you share this. I remember a time when I was 6 or 7 years old, I was talking to a friend of mine, and maybe I was 8, I don't know. He asked me which one of my parents was Jewish, or it was around the holidays, and he asked me if I had a Christmas tree. And I said, yeah, we have a Christmas tree, because we always would have a Christmas tree and a menorah. And those were like the only holidays. I didn't know of any other Jewish holidays really. And he said, oh, and your mother's Jewish, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, oh, so technically you're Jewish. And that technically like really stayed with me for a long time of what that meant. And, in college, I realized that it wasn't my last name that defined my Jewishness, but it was what I did with myself and what I did with my time. And I began to really connect to like answering these big questions. And eventually that put me on the road to rabbinical school, realizing that I really wanted to like facilitate people living meaningful lives through these texts and communities that I really found lovely. And then as I entered into rabbinical school, I started to realize that something that had happened in the path of my sort of integration into the Jewish community was a flattening out of the part of my identity that wasn't Jewish. Right, a lot of it was like in this rush to say, oh, Eric, and with all these sort of like, right, read the statement as problematically as you can, right? So saying, Eric, don't worry, your mother's Jewish, so you are Jewish, so there's no complexity there that you have to think about. And realizing how problematic that was in terms of erasing the Mexican identity, which is like very prominent in my own cultural understanding, erasing the sort of legacy of the sort of patriarchal white supremacy dimension of my father's father, and how challenging, and thinking of something that Emily said, one of the sort of infuriating things about the matrilineal principle with this stuff is that you get this sort of backwards name thing, right? So the Emily Cohen name can tell one story. The Eric Woodward story, it's so messed up. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. And so I really realized over the course of my time in rabbinical school that it was important to me to help other Jews like me to develop like a robust sense of what the other parts of our identities might mean and how those would speak to us. And and that can play out in all different ways. And it's really a part of like my passion now in my rabbinate.
Thank you so much for sharing. I just learned a lot about you, Eric, so thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
And I mean, there's a couple of themes that I really just want to pull out of what came out of all three of you, and things that I also relate to. Eric, as you were talking about the, oh, well, then you're really Jewish thing, that's a thing that I heard constantly. My mother is my Jewish parent, and sort of the feeling like that was made to sound like it was like comforting, like, oh, like you can't, but really it was an erasure of my father in so many ways, which is very uncomfortable. And it's kind of funny when I think about this dimension of, on the one hand, people with fathers who are Jewish and mothers who are not are told they don't count. And then people with mothers who are Jewish and fathers who are not are told that their fathers don't count. And it's kind of, no matter which way we slice it, it's erasing part of who we are in sort of very real ways. And I think I also find it very interesting when you layer the racial aspect on it as well. So thank you all for sort of setting off a bit of a light bulb for me about something that I've grappled with, trying to understand. But I think hearing all three of you reflect on it really made it very sort of clear to me the way that this functions. So we're going to have time to dive really into two sort of separate but very related areas before we open up the floor to questions. So I want to start a little bit more on the identity side of things. And talking a little bit about the intersection of race and interfaith families. So of course we know that many, but of course not all, Jews of color come from interfaith families, including three of us today. What do you see as some of those unique experiences of interfaith interracial families that impact their participation in Jewish spaces? Either Becky or Eric, if you want to take it away first, and then Emily, I know as a rabbi you serve many such people. So.
Sure, I can say a little something. I think one thing is that like privilege is a messed up thing in our society, and the number of times that and I don't know if this is me as like a white presenting male or as a Jew, like whatever this presentation is, that like people will make a racist comment to you about certainly growing up in Los Angeles, like Mexican Americans or about Mexican people or whatever sort of construction people are having there. And it's this very implicating moment where to identify yourself and say, no, that messes with me is like a very, the story I told earlier, right, was like not a non-complicated story. And there's a lot of like personal stuff that you don't want to share with somebody who's saying messed up things anyway. And you get into these very fraught conversations. So just as the first level, I think that the capacity of people to say things that are sort of like distancing and othering is very real. And we certainly hear that. I also think the creation of the concept of like we or the us them sort of conversation is very challenging. Like the Mexican side of my family is like a largely indigenous group in the Americas, and so I certainly think about that. Like many times people say things, and this isn't even a bad thing, but like this comes up. All of us Jews are immigrants in some sense, and I really think like no, I really had ancestors here who were here for 40,000 years or whatever, and what does that mean for my connection to this space? And then in a very personal sense, I feel sort of a connection of obligation around to use the sort of privilege I have. And, I'm like a person who presents physically, I think, in different ways, depending on all sorts of different moments or the time or where I am or whatever. But how do we use whatever sort of privilege we have to help other people who are much more vulnerable than us? I think is something that we can just constantly do. And how can we, how can you look in yourself and remember, like Becky said this really beautifully earlier, recognize like the dominance of like, there's a human being here before anything else. And so how can you remember that every other person is a human being just like you. And so you look in and you see your own like complicatedness and say, how does this reflect outward? And I think it reflects outward as all these beautiful obligations. Um, but Becky, I'm really curious what you think.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks for that question, Tema. You know, it's really interesting because I realized too, while just thinking about this panel, I have not, the first thing I'm concerned with now as I'm immersed in my studies to become a rabbi is not having an interfaith family, which was actually a huge preoccupation of mine, maybe years 1 and 2 in rabbinical school, like that idea of like having to prove myself. And I'm just going to name it. It's because my classmates told me to prove myself. There were people who were telling me that I wasn't Jewish, even though we were attending the same institution. And it's hard to hold respect for someone when you feel as though they're looking at you not as that human, but based on that boundary. And I think that, you know, now when I walk into a synagogue, especially given the past few months and the violence in Atlanta, um, I don't necessarily, I mean, to be honest, I'm in Spain. So the nearest synagogue is about 2 hours away. And, and so, but there's a Jewish quarter about a 10-minute walk from where I am, from the 1500s. And so I think that the first thing I think about is more, are they going to look at me and assume I'm Jewish? Like, will I pass at the door? And that has implications when it comes to passing for security to get in just to attend services. Like depending on Eric, when you were saying like sometimes you don't know how like perhaps you present to use that privilege. Like in the summer, if I'm darker because I'm out in the sun more, I can statistically track the resistance I get to walking into a synagogue. And that also applies to the way that people treat me when we're in services together or make assumptions about me as though I converted to Judaism for my white husband, who actually converted to Judaism for me. And so that changes the landscape of conversation and connection that we're able to have with each other on just a very first encounter, if that makes sense. And I think that for many white folks, that actually just like really does not register when some of these questions are asked, because they're asked to form connections, but they can actually be pretty hurtful. And I guess one thing that I'm an avid note taker. So one thing that I was thinking of, Eric, while you were speaking, was also how when we think about race and we think about interfaith families and expanding Judaism to hold the multiple identities that come along with the beautiful diversity that all of these families are coming with, that all of these individuals are coming with, I think sometimes we're also slow as communities to recognize that as we do that, the corpus and the actual mm, neshama, the soul of the community, has to change. The concerns of the community have to change to hold and mirror everything that those families are bringing with them and all of what that diversity implicates and implies. And it's my hope that we can actually, you know, do a better job at becoming more thoughtful and conscientious about what normal means and kind of dismantling the word a normal community, or what, you know, like the culture or the minhag of the community. What is that? Well, it's what we make it. But we're all in different positions to actually have a voice. And unfortunately, some of us, because of the way we look, the way we present, and multiple other identity factors, are listened to more than other people. And so especially on the frame and lens of race, I really hope that we're able to have these conversations more openly and also more truthfully. I think that's very important as well.
Thank you so much, Becky. Emily, from your vantage point as a rabbi serving a community, is there anything that you sort of observe about the different ways in which people might interact?
So I'm in a unique circumstance because of COVID. I've been doing everything on Zoom since I began with West End last summer. So I haven't been in our space, but I can say, just I'm learning so much, Becky and Eric, from what you're sharing, and it's really interesting for me because I'm somebody who, I have entry rights everywhere that I go. I walk into a room, people look at me, and they're like, "Oh, Jew." And that's like the way that it goes for me. And again, it's how it goes for my mother as well, because she's got dark brown hair and is white. And but it's fascinating because just even the comments people make assuming that I'm like full Ashkenazi can be really erasing. Like my mom is half like British Irish and half Portuguese, like from the Azores. And there's probably Jewish ancestry on that side, which is a whole different story that we can't prove. But I get really tan in the summer, but it's not because of my Jewish side. It's because of the Portuguese pieces. And then when people make comments about wasps or the goyim or whatever, it cuts so deep because on my mom's dad's side, I can trace back in the United States to the 1630s easily in like many lines because that's just how our family got here on that side. And then on my dad's side, I have the more typical, Lower East Side, Ellis Island, all that. But I think for me as a rabbi, I feel caught between acknowledging that for many Jews, this is new. The notion of our community being multiracial is new, and it's not new. And I'm trying to hold my community, and I just mean like the broad Jewish community, not only my community at West End, and also think about my cousins, Sophie and Ben Cohen, who are half Ashkenazi, half Japanese, and my brother-in-law and sister. My brother-in-law is of Pakistani descent, and if they have children, they will be Jews of color. So it's just like thinking about both the present and the future while trying to also hold a community that is really learning to question its assumptions, sometimes slower than some of us would like. And so for me, as somebody who carries a lot of privilege in Jewish spaces, I always have entry rights. I'm always worried about my visa expiring, and I'm always just aware of how to, or that I'm trying to thread that needle every time I open my mouth. So.
Thank you so much for sharing. And one thing, Emily, that you mentioned that I think is so important is that, yes, we have always been a multiracial Jewish community, and that is something that is growing. That is something that is becoming so many of our families now, if it was not already. And so I think bringing that sort of up in this context is so important. That I think, I often say, and this partially is from my own personal background, but talking about interfaith families and interfaith families is talking about interracial families. And of course, talking about Jewish families is also talking about racially diverse families. But there is that added sort of lens when we do this work. We make a lot of assumptions about who is in interfaith families. And I would hazard to say that some of them are incorrect, but many of them are also dated. And one anecdote that I'll mention is my mother is a therapist, and her doctoral research was on white women who had children with Black men and the therapeutic implications. And it was qualitative research working with people. And so it was a sort of a small sample. And when she put out her call of, I believe, the 10 participants, 7 were Jewish, 7 were Ashkenazi Jewish. And that matches the statistics that we know about interracial marriage. So just flagging that. So with the time that we have left, I want to talk a little bit about what has come up a number of times, which is the issue of boundaries and policy. So one thing that we all, I am sure, that we all, I am very sure, have seen or heard are questions around the need to balance boundaries, whether they are derived from halacha, from Jewish law, or sort of how a community defines themselves, with a desire to fully include and embrace interfaith families. And those things are real and exist in tension with each other quite often. I wonder if each of you can talk a little bit about your experiences there and what you've observed about this, and can this balancing act be done well, and how? Maybe this was a little unfair, but I'm going to throw it to Eric first because he is from the conservative movement.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's totally. And also just I got to give a hi to, I see Maytal Saltiel and Rachel Bashevskin on the participants, and Rabbi Robin Frisch. So it's really nice to see you guys even in this. So a few sort of approaches at an answer to this. One is that the conservative movement is really in a place where there's a lot of change happening among a lot of people. And as much as it sounds like, especially when I describe it like this way, it's like the conservative movement, it really is very diverse in terms of how different rabbis apply various halachic statements from the movement. So, and hi Nancy as well, I see Nancy. So one thing that comes up, I'll just talk about sort of descent to this sort of matrilineal and patrilineal thing, and what I find to be particularly problematic about it. You know, the way that the conservative movement has historically understood Judaism, achieving Judaism by birth, has to do with how what the gender is of a parent, right? So either a mother or a father, and a mother being Jewish will make a child Jewish, and a father not, is sometimes how that's sketched out. I don't think that actually describes the halakha particularly well, and this isn't sort of where the movement is coming from on this, or it shouldn't be. And there are great teachings about this. You know, the place where I first started connecting this was actually Yeshivat Hadar, where Rabbi Ethan Tucker really teaches about this and complicates this. And he sort of traces this idea of what he calls the matrilineal principle, and says, and you sort of see through the sources, which he goes through like way more exhaustively than I could ever do, because he's Ethan Tucker and that's his thing. But you see this idea that having a parent who isn't Jewish puts you in some sort of a gray area. And at a certain point in the codes, like a line is drawn. But for me, what was really pastorally meaningful for me was realizing that actually existed in this gray area, right? Then rather than a sort of binary thing of you're Jewish or you're not Jewish, I began to understand, like, no, I actually live in this gray area. And this was actually much more true to my experience. So I'd had conservative rabbis tell me, oh no, you're just simply 100% Jewish. Don't question it. There's nothing complicated there. And that really erased parts of my identity and was not healthy for me. But realizing that I lived in this gray area was really clarifying. And something that Rav Eitan, that Ethan really promoted, was the value of going to mikvah for everybody, and for people who have a non-Jewish mother, a non-Jewish father, as well, as like a part of like clarifying your identity. And I did that, and that felt like very meaningful for me. But in general, you know, there are a lot of conservative rabbis who are trying to push this. And I also think this is like one of the, you know, to get the movement to think about this in sort of more broad ways. Within the movement, you're going to see different rabbis. You know, one of the things that happens in the conservative movement is there are the sort of rules that are on the books, but personal status issues are always handled individually by like a rabbi in a synagogue. And so, you know, if you're involved with a conservative synagogue, it's really worth talking to your rabbi, because there may be more to your story or more to the dynamic than what you think is at stake. But just on the face of it, I do think the gender dimension of this is like extremely problematic. And I don't think it always points to people's like lived reality. In terms of interfaith relationships and things like that, there is a prohibition in the conservative movement on a conservative rabbi performing a wedding between a person who's Jewish and a person who isn't Jewish. And that is something that's like a very strong prohibition. And the area, you know, that's one thing. The gray area within the movement is everything beyond that, right? So what about an ufruf, right, for a couple where one member isn't Jewish? Like, that's a different sort of conversation. What about talking about it in the bulletin? Well, there's so many sort of different things there. And a lot of the really interesting growth in the conservative movement is happening around those issues rather than the officiation thing. And then really briefly, and I recognize that this answer is like fundamentally apologetic, right? Like, I'm sort of trying to justify something that I like don't love, but I will say this, and like, well, I'll say more of that in a minute. I think that something I've learned from Jews I've interacted with and from my parents and my own experiences sort of over time is that a lot of what stinks about being an interfaith couple when you're received poorly, either by a conservative synagogue or by any synagogue, is that instead of being treated like a human being, you're treated like a statistic or a number or a problem. And, I often say that interfaith families want the same things that other families want, which is services that aren't boring and horrible, a Hebrew school that's inspiring, a clergy team who cares about them. And that these things are the essence of this. And I think that when we let the statistical story, which I don't think is an accurate depiction of the statistics anyway, but when we let that guide us rather than our sense that every person is a human being in the image of God who we owe respect and dignity and belonging to, I think that clarifies so much. And I'll end there, because like I could go on for this and give my whole conservative movement speech about this, but like I think this is just such it's complicated. And I would always say, if you're in a position where you have a conservative rabbi, you should always feel like you can put pressure on them as a moral person, as a person who deserves to be seen, and that's a good thing.
This is going to be the fun part where, because we all come from different sort of areas of Jewish life and have had different experiences, I'm sure that there's going to actually be some differences in approach here. And I'm very excited for that, because I think this is a needle that we're all trying to thread within sort of the in some cases strictures and in other cases sort of more flexibility that our respective movements provide. One thing that I just want to say, because it sort of popped into my head, is one of the lines that I've heard about interfaith relationships very often is, sure, it might be good for that Jew, but it's not good for the Jews. And I feel like that captures some of the approach that actually makes people feel like they're being seen as a statistic rather than an individual. And so I just want to sort of identify that as, I've heard that line like actually used many times, but also the spirit of it is something that I think is really pervasive. So Emily, I know that this is something that you think about a lot, so I'm going to ask you to weigh in.
Thank you. And thank you, Eric, for just like laying all of that out and explaining your point of view around this. I wish I found more in what you shared that resonated. It's hard for me to hear these arguments from conservative rabbis, because I have found that saying no to a ceremony, even if it's done lovingly, even if it's done with, we'll do an ufruf for you, you can have all of these different things, we'll call you up for an aliyah, your non-Jewish partner can be on the bima with you, even if you do all of that, it's still saying this relationship is not the right one for our community. And I think that the same is true for patrilineal descent and matrilineal and mikveh. I've thought for years about whether or not going to mikveh was something that made sense for me. But ultimately what I came to was that if I went to mikveh, I would get a certificate of Geirut on the other side. I would get something that said I wasn't Jewish on some level, and now I am. And for me, that made no sense. And I think for most patrilineal Jews who are raised in Jewish homes, there's just a degree to which it's like, you're asking me to convert to what? And sure, call it an affirmation, call it an alignment of status with identity. There's lots of lovely ways of describing it. But ultimately, if you take all of the children to mikveh, which I know is actually a practice in a lot of conservative and post-denominational communities, that they just have every kid go to mikveh pre-mitzvah, which I think is a cool idea in theory, except that the patrilineal kids convert. and the matrilineal and two-parent kids just take a dip. And I don't think that that's fair. When we're talking about the Jewish future, we're talking about, as of the most recent Pew study, 72% of non-Orthodox Jews who are choosing to partner with people who aren't Jewish. I imagine that in the one that's coming out in a week, that number is going to be higher. If you look at millennial Jews, 48% were raised with one Jewish parent and one parent who wasn't Jewish. And again, with Gen Z, that's likely to actually flip and be more people raised by one Jewish parent instead of two Jewish parents. And so we can look at the gender breakdown. And actually, my last year of rabbinical school, I wrote a conservative style tshuva with a classmate of mine on patrilineal descent, because I wanted to know for myself where that halachic argument could be made. And I've listened to Rav Eitan Tucker's teaching on this, and I guess I'm done with more traditional spaces saying that there's something suboptimal about Jews like me and families like my family. And so what I actually hope for when I'm talking about transparency within Jewish communities is honesty. My senior year of rabbinical school, I did a study where I looked at websites from conservative, Reconstructionist, and Reform synagogues. And I looked specifically at what they said about interfaith families. And this might be surprising, but my favorite was a conservative synagogue that had a whole page that said, we welcome your family. Here's what we do. Here's what we don't do. Here's why. And it's not a synagogue that I would have chosen to join, but I gave them so much kavod, so much respect and honor for having just said, here's where our lines are. We all draw lines. When I walk into an Orthodox synagogue, I don't expect to be treated in the same way that I would were I a man. And when I walk into a conservative synagogue, I don't want to play don't ask, don't tell. I did that for a semester of rabbinical school, and I say this as a queer person as well. I did this during a semester of rabbinical school when I was studying in Jerusalem, and I knew that if I was upfront about my status, I would not be permitted to be a full Jew in that space. I'd be allowed to study, but not to participate in ritual in any way. And I wasn't cool with that. And I just was like, I'm not going to say anything, and they're probably not going to ask. And they didn't. But I never want to do that again. And I don't want any Jew to have to do that again. So I would hope that rather than saying, come to me as a conservative rabbi and talk to me, that all conservative rabbis could just be a little bit more upfront with where their policies are, whether they agree with them or not. My rabbi from college is a graduate of JTS from many decades ago. And it was really hard when we had a conversation where he had to tell me that he couldn't do my wedding if I were to get married. But I so appreciate his honesty. It meant so much to me. And so that's really what I hope, is that we can just have a place of deeper honesty across the Jewish board.
Thank you so much, Emily, for sharing, and I think for bringing some real sort of color to the experience of being on that side of the conversation, as well as your experience sort of in rabbinic leadership. Becky, over to you. And we're running short on time because we could just go forever on this stuff. Becky, over to you. And then just to give everyone a sense of where we're going to go, I'm going to ask each of you for like one sort of thought about what people could do better, and then try and get to a couple of questions before we wrap up. So Becky, over to you.
Well, the first thing I would say first as a disclaimer, what I'm about to share is just my personal view and not really emblematic of what the reform movement necessarily has as its policy, as I'm still in formation as well, working out where I'm drawing my own boundaries as a clergy person. And I'm also in the middle of finals. So as I apply some sociology to this, I actually, the first questions that came to mind, Tema, when you had said boundaries, were who makes them and why do they make them? And I guess, I'll share a story that actually is very painful. When I was in college living in Israel during the summer with some other Hillel-oriented classmates, one of my classmates came up to me and said, At the time, my father had just started working at a Jewish day school, a conservative Jewish day school that this person's brother went to. And so this person came up to me and said, I heard that your mom is not Jewish. And I said, hi, nice to meet you. You know, that's not like how I normally lead a conversation, but that was what she led with. And then continued to say, I just need to let you know, I don't think your parents should have ever gotten married or had you as a child. And you're literally detracting from the Jewish people. And the question I walked away with was, how are those holy words? And she gave me all of these reasons. She said, my dad's a rabbi and he taught me this. And, you know, we're against your father being at this school as the new principal because he's not married to a Jew, because your mother didn't convert, which to me is bonkers as well, because my mother, as a former deacon of her church, is probably the only person in my life who I feel like truly understands a call, like my call to do this, and has been the most supportive, taught me my first letters of Hebrew. So for me, when boundaries and law prevent us from seeing, I guess I'll just like default back to the human, to seeing that we're part of each other and we're connected. When they prevent us from seeing the human being in front of us and from seeing that person not as a something to inspire fear or that will detract from our own identity simply by existing in their own identity, that's when I don't just like, you know, like lose the I lose the logic of it. Like I don't really understand. For me, theologically, it doesn't make sense anymore. And so I think that boundaries are important. And in the reform movement, we do try to, you know, like encourage people to do the learning and create your boundaries. Like what boundaries work for you after we give you all of this learning and education. And that is an empowering feeling. I felt it. And I think that sometimes it's also it's a hard task to put in front of people. So I'm holding both. I think that boundaries are very important, and I love, you know, feeling firm in my softball team that I play with in Central Park long ago, because that is, you know, I'm part of that team. But at the same time, what I really focus on when it comes to boundaries is why were they made and who were they made to protect? And that's something I think we're starting to question in society in general now, but more so in our Jewish communities.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone has time to stay on like maybe 5 or 10 extra minutes. Excellent. Okay. Just before we open the floor, we do have a few questions that I do want to try to get to, because I think they will just sort of pluck out some of the pieces of what we've talked about a little bit more specifically. But just before we do that, I want to ask each of you very briefly, if you had one word of wisdom, and we all have many, but if you had one that you want to leave everyone with today, to bring back to their organizations who are looking to break down barriers to participation for interfaith families, and more fully engage them, what would those words of wisdom be? And I am just going to go around my screen. So Emily.
Stop talking about interfaith families like something that exists outside of your community instead of probably realistically at the center of it.
Amazing. Becky.
I would say if a dilemma comes up or a question where those boundaries are something that really rise, I would encourage people to ask the question, like, why not? As in, you know, like, well, what's really preventing me from supporting this family in this way? And truly think about it. Just why not? And if you can come up with a legitimate reason that you feel comfortable with, then
Thank you, Becky. And Eric, over to you.
I would say it's the task of a synagogue to help, and if any Jewish institution, to help every person to be fully themselves and to help everybody become who they are. And we need to be brave enough to believe that we can all flourish when we promote people who are trying to be who they are, and that's something we can be strong about.
Thank you all so much. I've learned so much from you, both about you and about your work and about your leadership in the community. I'm going to we have a few questions that I want to get to, and if anyone else wants to throw a question in the box, I will try and weave it in. So one of them is very specific, and Becky, it refers to that anecdote you told earlier about being asked to prove yourself by your classmates, and this person is wondering, how much do you think this was because of coming from an interfaith family? How much do you think was about your family's ethnic background? Can you really separate that out? Yeah.
I don't think you can separate the two. I just view my experiences intersectionally, and I think that, you know, in rabbinical school, I don't know if this was my co-panelists experience, like we're all trying to prove ourselves, like who knows the most about, you know, Rashi, or who knows, and you'll just, I don't know, like my first year I would just throw Jewish names of historians and random conversations to make myself feel better, you know, about like feeling Jewish enough, like feeling as though I could be a rabbi. And I think that that was definitely a part of it. I think that there's also a lot of like proving oneself to self, if that makes sense. And unfortunately, that manifests in, you know, putting others down in some ways. Like I have a great relationship with my classmates, and we have difficult and hard conversations when these types of conversations happen. But I do think that part of it, I don't think that you can really separate, I can't at least separate my Korean identity from my Jewish identity and from my identity as I present racially to others in the world, and how their experience of me impacts me as well. Yeah.
Great. And this actually leads perfectly into the next question, which was to Eric. So Eric, is it possible in your opinion to be 100% Jewish and also 100% your other side? Is it helpful in some ways not to speak of an acknowledged identity as a pie that gets like cut up into percentages, but instead of who a person is 100%? And, you know, three of us being mixed race on this call, I feel like this is a question close to my heart as well. So Eric, dive right in.
Yeah, I mean, yes, that's exactly right. I think it's that, yes, the pie analogy is like good for just like showing a map of where people are living or something like that, but it's not helpful for identity, which I think is mixed and complicated and messy. Which, like, if you try a sliced pie, it's actually messy. It doesn't all work that way. But and I think that you are, I mean, like no aspect of my identity is static, and at different times I feel drawn in different directions, and there are different things that bring it out. And, you know, something I think that, like, I try to think a lot about, like the spirit, I feel like there is so much spiritual work done by so many people in this world. And our goal is to connect deeply to that. And I remember, so in Israel, there's like the tunnel, the Hezekiah's tunnel that there was, you know, this wall, Jerusalem was like a walled city, and they wanted to dig a tunnel to a spring. And so you had to have people going from one side digging a tunnel down and people digging from the other side digging a tunnel down to meet in the middle. And that was how you sort of dug a tunnel underground. And all these people were digging to one place. And there's like a hike where you can do that, and I did not do it. It's like too freaky for me. But everybody else says it's great. But I kind of think that way about not just among Jews, but about other people, that everybody is digging in the dark. We're all digging tunnels. And what faith is the idea that we're all digging tunnels to the same place. And they're not all going to be the same. And my my abuela never was interested in my Jewish life. Like, she was a strong Mexican Catholic, and that was very much her identity. But her spiritual life and sort of her ancestral spiritual life is resonant to me. And the ancestors of mine who, as Emily was saying, like the WASP, right? The people who were like the white ancestors of my dad's side. I'm not like, I don't know them, but I know them genealogically through looking at stuff, and their identity was similar. And we're trying to figure out where that is. And we are all this sort of compilation of so many stories and so many journeys that I think we're trying to figure that out. So we're always 100% ourselves, but that 100% of ourselves isn't something stable. And I guess that's my answer there.
Right. Yeah, I think about that a lot, about like what part of us leads in different spaces. And all of us have, when we think about what intersectionality means as sort of an analysis of who a person is and the ways that we interact with the world, all of us live with multiple identities that are more present to the people we interact with and more present for ourselves in different contexts. So there was one final question, which unfortunately we're not going to really have time to dive into, but I just want to mention it, and then I will speak to it very briefly. And then unfortunately, I'm going to have to bring this to a close. I could talk to you all day, but we can't do that. So the question was that Becky mentioned earlier, the need for organizations and institutions to hold our diversity in actions and planning. And just looking for suggestions for how an organization can ensure they're doing this, especially beyond their own membership, to ensure we're always holding our multiracial background as a Jewish community in acts and speech. So I'm going to speak to that very briefly. One is come to some of the other wonderful trainings that I do, which I will mention later in more depth. But also there are organizations who specifically talk about Jewish multiracial identity and working in Jewish spaces to really make sure that that's incorporated. I would strongly recommend checking out the work of Bechol Lashon on that. This is one of their great specialties, and they are dear friends of 18 Doors. So with that, I'm going to bring this to a close. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to all of us for joining us today and for your insightful questions. What my biggest hope is that each one of you leaves with some new learning and at least one thing you'll be able to take back to your organization to deepen your engagement of interfaith families. This year, we're going to be presenting more opportunities to learn from Jewish professionals and a clergy from across the field on issues that are topical and critical for our work with interfaith families. I'm thrilled to announce our upcoming series, What You Need to Know About Racism When Working with Interfaith Families. Our first installment will be a roundtable on anti-Black racism with both me and my colleague Tanny Prell, the director of 18 Doors Chicago, as well as other mixed race and Black Jewish professionals. Stay tuned for the announcement of this talk, and it will be in mid-June. We will be following that one up with a panel, especially responding to the alarming rise in anti-Asian racism, with a panel of Asian Jewish communal leaders who will be talking about what people who work with interfaith families need to know about anti-Asian racism. And I am optimistic that Becky will be on that as well. You will all receive a link to a follow-up survey, which Lexi has dropped in the chat. I hope you will take a few minutes to complete it. Hearing from you what would be the most helpful in your roles helps us best design future learning opportunities. Last and certainly not least, you may have heard that last week we launched our first e-learning unit, The Language and Optics of Interfaith Engagement. It is available free of charge on our website on the Jewish Organizations page or directly at 18doors.org/elearning. Thank you one last time for joining us today, and I really hope for those of you who are return participants to see you again soon, and for those of you joining us for the first time, that it won't be the last. With that, I just want to thank our panelists one final time for a really enriching conversation and draw this to a close. Have a wonderful day, everyone.